much, David, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I can hardly wait to hear myself speak after all of that. But can I just say I tend to prefer this particular analogy and illustration. I think it appeals to good farmer humour. Good morning, I'm Alex Lowe. I'm the Secondment Special Projects Liaison Officer in the Regional Coordination and Statistics Unit of the Rural Research Division of the Department of Agriculture. Yep, and I'm Bill. And I suppose I just want to associate with Bill in this particular cartoon. I don't particularly have any expertise to be addressing a group like you this afternoon, bar the fact I'm a community enthusiast. I'm one of those people that believes that after family, probably community is probably the most important kind of like social entity that we actually have. And despite what we might hear from politicians and through the media every day, people don't all just live in an economy, we live in this thing called community. And I suppose it's great to have that opportunity to just put that into the perspective into a day like today, talking about this thing called community and how particularly in times that are particularly tough in parts of the state, we know that's a real reality at the present time. Where does this thing called community fit in terms of supporting people, and also how do we actually use these times to strengthen the social and the economic infrastructure of these particular communities? I need to say I really do approach this afternoon though with a bit of trepidation. Firstly, I represent the graveyard session of this particular conference. I stand between you and drinking a lot of grog, and I'm sure that many of you are particularly focused on that at the present time, so that's always a challenge. My second challenge is that you've given me 45 minutes to address this particular topic. I don't know if you're aware of how long any presenter can actually hope to retain the attention of an audience, but there's been a lot of research done on this, particularly by a group called Stanford University, which is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. And they decided it would be an important thing to work out under perfect circumstances, and by that they mean early in the morning when everyone's fresh, in a room that's got plenty of light, people are interested in the topic, there ain't much alcohol in people's system. How long does the average presenter hope to retain the attention of the audience? And they claim under perfect circumstances, and that means that people are actually interested in the topic, 11 minutes is all that any presenter has got. Now, you've actually given me 4.5 times as much as that. Now, the only thing that gives me a degree of comfort is that Stanford, as I said, Stanford's a real university. It's not like Curtin or Murdoch or whatever. It's a real university that only delves into kind of like sophisticated research. And they thought, wouldn't it be interesting to work out, if people are not concentrating and following the speaker, what have their minds shifted to? And so they did this international research, and believe it or not, they discovered that after 11 minutes, 24% of their sample were thinking of sex. They claim when Australians got added to the sample, it actually jumped to 32%. But I think that was only because the Kiwi was actually on the research team, and that always kind of like biased things. But what it does mean is in approximately 8 minutes, the majority of you are going to be quite bored with what I'm saying, but you will be having a good time. So that's good. But I am excited to be here for kind of like 4 or 5 reasons. The first is simply this. I love spending time with people who live in small rural communities. I spent most of my life there, and I love this particular quote. The nice thing about living in a small town is that when you don't know what you're doing, someone else does. And I'm sure all of us kind of like experience that type of kind of like community life. The second thing is today has actually been a wonderful learning experience. Amazing to kind of like carve these times out of our lives. And I know it's not without a cost. I mean, it means most of us are going to have to pedal faster tomorrow and the next day to catch up. But how important it is, and particularly as this quote says, in times of change, it is the learners who inherit the future. And those who finish learning find themselves equipped to live in a world that no longer exists. And I suppose to me it's tremendous to be part of a day like today when you've just been exposed not just to some amazing presenters, but the conversations that have gone around the table and that opportunity to leapfrog on each other's experience. I think that one of the great experiences of conference is just what we can learn. And I love this quote, whoever invented the first wheel was smart, whoever invented the other 3 was the genius. And it just seems to me that it's days like today that we do have that opportunity to kind of like leapfrog on each other's experiences. And so it is vital to come together. I also value learning because of an experience that I'm very familiar with. Now, this is a place called Beechworth. It's a small Victorian country town, population about 3,000, 3 hours out of Melbourne in northeast Victoria. 25 years ago, when I was introduced to this town, it was padded up with galvanised iron. You couldn't give away a business. Half the businesses in the town had closed down. The town only had 2 industries left. One was an asylum, the other was a jail, and both of them were in the process of being closed down. It was a town in total decline. 3 months ago, I read an article about this particular town, and it's termed, in this particular, and this is the top tourism magazine of Australia, they called Beechworth the best small town tourist story in the country. I find that an amazing 25-year kind of like experience of change. 25 years ago, here's a place padded up. It certainly wasn't a place where people actually gravitated to, and yet 25 years on, it can actually win the accolade of being Australia's top small town tourist destination. How did it happen? Well, the interesting thing is, it happened because of one guy. His name was Tom Toole. He reckons with a surname like Toole, you do get sick of being called shit, dickhead and shovel. And he reckons the best $24 he ever spent was changing his name by Depol to Tom O'Toole. This guy was brought up in the region. This guy cannot read or write. This guy was kicked out of school at 12. This guy, after being removed from school, found the only job he could find in the town of Beechworth was to work in the local bakery, because in his words, no one else was dumb enough to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and light the fires. But this is a guy who did an apprenticeship in this town and then went off. He set up a bakery in the Northern Territory, in an Aboriginal community. And for those of you who can remember that way back, there was a famous bakery in Augusta back in the 1970s and early 80s. Well, that was Tom O'Toole, who was running a bakery back then that was employing over 30 staff in a place like Augusta. But his family life broke up, his marriage broke up, he's left with 2 little kids, and he returns home to be near family and his mother. And he decides to buy the bakery where he did his apprenticeship. The interesting thing about this particular bakery is he had to close it for 6 weeks to get rid of the rats out of the bakery. It's a bakery that had a turnover of $100,000 and it employed 2 part-time staff. When he opened the bakery 6 weeks later, he was employing 6 full-time staff. He hadn't even traded at that stage, but had a confidence in where he was going. Within 3 months, in a retail cafe bakery in the town 3 hours out of Melbourne, on a road to nowhere, he was actually employing 23 staff in this particular bakery. And today, it is the biggest turnover retail bakery in the Southern Hemisphere. There's no bakery in Sydney, Melbourne, Auckland, Brisbane or Perth that has his job creation facts or his turnover. This year will turn over close to $8 million in a cafe retail in a small country town. He employs 76 staff in this town, and as a business, he'll attract 800,000 customers through the door this year. An amazing story. You're like opening a bakery in Mirrabin and having that type of actual impact. And I suppose when you look at his kind of like achievements, it's quite amazing for a guy who kicked out of school at 12, can't read and write, but has this amazing ability to kind of like turn over the dollar. And it's not just been a one kind of like fluky turnover experience. He's actually replicated the story in 5 other small Victorian country towns. And together, those 6 bakeries now employ close to 300 people. He's one of the biggest employers in regional Victoria. An amazing story. And I've got to know this guy well, and we often holiday together, we're very close friends, and I love to often say to Tom, how do we make dough your way? It's an amazing kind of like story that you've actually woven. And it's amazing that he'll actually often share the things he's on about. Like, he is a bakery and smell is the strongest human sense. So he's got things like pipes running from the bakehouse to the veranda and fans on the veranda pumping hot bread smells up and down the main street. He does kind of like he never takes less than $25,000 on a Sunday, but he does invest $1,500 into a jazz band all day Sunday. He realises today it's all about retail experience, not about having the best bread in town. He kind of like does employ someone 3 days a week who visits every B&B, hotel, motel within a 2-hour radius of Beechworth, gives them a big bag of fresh biscuits and a wad of these vouchers saying, why don't you treat your customer to a free cappuccino at the Beechworth Bakery? He reckons particularly Kiwis will drive 2 hours out of their way for a free coffee, Target and whatever. August is his worth trading month, so he turns that into Kindy month, where he gets every kindergarten, pre-primary school to visit the bakery. And then he gets them making their own biscuits, and he says, you know, we are the biggest turnover bakery in Australia. You imagine the chaos that these brats create. But he said, you know what, 1 in 3 of them will actually leave and within a month be back with their parents. You know, this is a guy that really does understand how you actually appeal to the customer, and above all, how you actually motivate your staff to kind of like want to kind of like be the best business. I love this kind of like statement where he says, I spend a lot of money on my staff and some of the locals think I'm investing too much, and they'll often say, Tom, what if you train them and they leave? To which I normally respond, what if I don't train them and they stay? I mean, the logic of this guy is amazing. There's a guy who set up an exchange program now with 3 bakeries, one in Ireland, one in Norway, one in New Zealand, where staff can spend 12 months away and not lose their job. In fact, have a job in these other countries where staff swap jobs, swap houses, swap cars, keep the same partner and have a fantastic career. He's into all of these kind of like initiatives in terms of kind of like what it is. And I suppose what he says to me, Peter, if by 10 o'clock in the morning I'm not thinking of a new idea, I actually fear I will fall behind. I need to have that open mind constantly and be willing to kind of like embrace fresh ideas. I need to be looking at my business and at my town and at my community and constantly be asking the question, how do I do it smarter? How do I do it different? How can I do it better? It's kind of like the mindset that he actually has. And I suppose he rattles off heaps of things he does. But at the end of the day, I love the simple advice he always gives me. And that is simply, if you want to be a success, particularly, he says, in rural and regional Australia, you need to be a continuous learner. And I suppose that's why I value days like today, because they are opportunities to kind of like leave behind those challenges that we face and begin within the context of a group like this to kind of like listen, debate, hear, interpret, and above all learn new things. So from that point of view, I'm excited to kind of like provide the end bit to what I know has been a stimulating day for all of you. The third thing I'm excited about is simply this is a day with farmers. And I do believe that no other group has chosen a harder career choice than farmers. I think you'd all agree with it. It's a tough choice. It's one of those careers where every day, in many ways, is a challenge. It calls for people to be constantly kind of like adaptive. And so, again, to be in an environment with people who have chosen kind of like what is a really tough kind of like career. I don't believe there's any industry sector that faces as many challenges and change as does the farming community today. And certainly the thing that we're aware of is that the future ain't what it used to be, both in terms of our individual farms and that collection of farms that make up our rural communities. I love this particular cartoon that came out of CBH in terms of many ways it captures kind of like the reality of what all of you face within the kind of like the profession and the industry sector. And I suppose it's one of those places where you are constantly being exposed to this thing called change. For many of you, it's been an incredibly tough year. For some of you in the audience, I know it's been a great year. It's one of the things about Mother Nature. It never seems to quite do things equally or spread across the state. And certainly, like some of the statistics earlier in the year, I hope it's getting better than that, but they're pretty scary figures that have been put up. And certainly, there are parts of the state when you do drive, you begin to see it. And we were all exposed to those amazing stories, and particularly out there in the eastern part of the state, in terms of what people are going through. A farmer sharing me with the other day that he hasn't really had a decent crop for 10 years. I mean, those type of stories are pretty devastating. And certainly as one sees the loss that we're actually seeing within rural communities. Unfortunately, in some of those areas, the traditional people who would buy, the neighbours, are just not interested in actually expanding because they also are struggling. And certainly when we look at the grim reality of Mother Nature and its impact, again, it's within the context of this industry sector in our rural communities. We need people who are actually able to be adaptive and resilient in terms of these challenges. And certainly the future ain't what it used to be. And certainly for some, it seems to me that the end is nigh in many ways in terms of how long we can cope with it. That particular cartoon, I think, unfortunately, summarises the challenge for a number of people. And certainly the words of Woody Allen, I always find Woody Allen's humour quite interesting. We stand at a crossroads, one path leads to despair and destruction, the other to annihilation. May we have the wisdom to choose the right path. And certainly for some farmers, that is the grim reality. And particularly often, the communities that they're part of are going through a similar decline in many ways. And particularly in parts of the wheat belt and the eastern wheat belt, we're seeing phenomenal challenge about keeping together many of our communities. And if Mother Nature isn't a big enough challenge, then there are always ones thrown at us by politicians. Just the whole movement to putting year 7s, for example, into high school. Devastating for communities. I was out at Goomalling the other day, a place as close to Perth as Goomalling, and yet it's probably the number one biggest issue that community faces, and the impact that is likely to have on their education institutions and the retention of families and the like. And we know, particularly in terms of retail in many of these communities, you just need to drive through to see the number of empty stores and shops. So we do live in times of incredible change, and I suppose the whole thing of where does community fit into where all this is at. I'm one of those people who's particularly love reading the history of agriculture, of farming groups, bodies in WA, and the contribution that people have made. And if you haven't delved into just publications like this, amazing stories, and often in times of hardship, people often have done amazing things. I just love the the story of cooperative bulk handling and the vision that people had there, the Thompsons and so on, to start to create this in terms of the opposition that they actually faced. When you read at the actual opposition that they actually had to go through. But I love this particular book that was written about them, where they said, but they won through. They achieved those things. And I love what it said in the foreword of that book. They were able to do these things because they were not afraid to be different and to cooperate. Here is community, here is Australian mateship. CBH was born out of the need to work together. And I suppose that's what, to me, community represents. It gives us that chance to realise we're not on our own, that we can actually, if we can begin to learn the art of holding hands with others in community, maybe there are things that we can do to build our sense of resilience, both as individual operators but also as community members. And I suppose to me one of the great examples of this has been what was happened in the banking movement over the last 14 years. You're probably aware that from about 1995 through to 2005, our 4 big banks in this country decided to turn their back on many small country towns. In fact, in small towns and poorer urban suburbs, they closed down close to 5,000 bank branches. And there were many communities in WA that were left without a banking option. Not one of them was actually, believe it or not, closed down because they were losing money. This was all about making more money for the shareholders and a bigger return. If we can only sell off properties, get people into regional banking, onto internet banking, cut staff, we can actually have a bigger return back to the shareholder. But what I find amazing is a whole pile of communities said, you know what, we sense the bank is actually probably one of the most profitable businesses in town. And with the support of this regional bank called Bendigo, they decided to enter into a franchise arrangement and kind of like become their own bankers. An amazing story, particularly for those, and I'm sure that some of you have been caught up in this movement, because in particularly Whitbelt WA, we've got a very, very kind of like successful history of towns adopting this particular model. What I find interesting though, it ain't easy. You know, today you've got to have close to $1 million in shareholders' contributions. You've got to be able to guarantee $4 to $5 million in kind of like deposits. And Bendigo Bank tell me in Bendigo that close to 11,000 communities across Australia have contacted them about doing this option. The interesting thing is only 300 communities have actually pulled it off. And 40 of them happen to be in Western Australia. And I suppose when I look at their stories, where kind of like people came together and did those basic things of setting up the kind of like the card table in front of the local co-op on Friday and Saturday, and kind of like starting to flog shares and began to get that community network going and get people behind it, and above all, try to convince particularly conservative farmers to move away from traditional banking sources and support the new bank. And the interesting thing is that we've seen in places, you know, like the Gamellings and the places, you know, the Mount Barkers of this world, the Yorks, the 2Js, and a pile of other kind of like towns, we've actually seen the power of community working. To me, I think it's probably the most exciting community economic movement we've seen in Australia since the co-op movement in the early part of the 20th century. And the interesting thing that many of these kind of like banks have not only returned back a service and traditional banking things like banking on Saturday morning, they've maintained jobs. You know, they go to the small little towns, and to see young people still have an option for a white-collar job in a bank in some of these towns is quite amazing. And to hear the stories of many communities where fundamentally they've actually saved the town. The other interesting fact is that not one of the 300 have failed. And the interesting thing is this year, collectively, they will have returned back over $100 million as a dividend to their local communities. That's a phenomenal kind of like story. And I suppose one that really appeals to me is in a place like Mount Barker, for example, where the community bank is now returning back probably close to $150,000 a year. They realised that they needed to be strategic about how they were returning that back. They realised that health was a massive issue. They had a pretty crappy kind of like health centre. They couldn't retain a permanent doctor. But, you know, they went to Bendigo Bank and said, listen, why don't you give us $1 million as a loan based on the fact we'll return back to you $100,000 a year. And with that $1 million, they went to their local council and said, why don't you chip in $1 million? And with that $2 million, they leveraged another $2 million out of state and Commonwealth and built a $4 million health centre. Today there are 3 doctors in town. And I look at stories like that happening across rural Australia. And how's it happening? It's not happening by the cavalry based in Perth or Canberra charging into these towns doing things. It's happening because local people, including often the leadership of local farmers, are actually making kind of like this stuff actually happen on the ground. I suppose what it illustrates is just the power of this kind of like social entity that we call community. And I suppose I'll make it clear at the end of this day, in terms of where we're at as a kind of rural set of rural communities and districts, and the challenges we face, realise the power that often lies within kind of like this thing called community. That where communities do come together, do galvanise, boy, we can see positive results. And it's interesting that when you talk to that baker and you try to tease out to him his recipe for making dough, one of the things that he would say to his colleagues within the retail sector is, you know, you need to kind of like stick up your hand and get involved in community. It's fundamental about running a successful business within a community. He would say there's an interface, an interdependence between the small businesses in a town and the community. And I would say there's even a greater interdependence between the farms that surround a town and the particular town. We know that they are interdependent. And we need to have an interest in how we kind of like look at how we support and build each other. I suppose the two things I want to say about community in light of the audience here today is firstly this one, that community connection is absolutely essential for positive mental and physical health. And particularly for people going through a tough time, farmers who really are struggling financially and have huge debt levels. You know, there's times like this they actually need to kind of like be interrelating with other people. We actually have a look at the definition of mental health that the World Health Organization holds up as a definition. And again, it's interesting to see that central to it is this kind of like contribution and involvement, kind of like at the community, and a recognition by the community that you've got something to offer, not just in terms of kind of like your ability to run kind of like the business. And we actually know that the evidence tells us quite clearly that kind of like being involved with community and community groups are as important for health as things like healthy food and kind of like exercise. Not long ago I was in Canberra and I heard two doctors from California sharing their results of kind of like 25 years of research into the importance that community connection plays in health. You have a look at those things and look, I think most people would agree with the first one, that people who lack social and community ties are much more likely to die than people with extensive kind of like contacts. But look at the next two. Joining a community group cuts in half your odds of dying next year. We all need to rush out this afternoon and sign up for a few more groups and whatever. But, you know, look at the third one. Joining a community organisation for fun was better for health than giving up smoking. That will also come as a degree of comfort for those of you who still smoke. And I think, as one social commentator put it, as a rule of thumb, if you belong to no group but decide to join one, you cut your risk of dying over the next year in half. If you smoke and belong to no group, it's a toss-up statistically whether you should stop smoking or start joining. Now, those are the realities. But the simple reality I give you is that from Tim Costello, probably the leading social commentator in Australia today, when he just reminds us of a very simple fact, and that is isolation kills more people each year than tobacco-related diseases. And it just seems to me that particularly when times are tough and people often withdraw into themselves, these are the times that they do need friends and the community encouraging that integration and that interaction with kind of like other people. And I suppose that at times like this, the importance of community and its myriad of kind of like organisations and activities and ways that people can be involved is just so important. And that interdependence between the farm and the town is just one of those areas. The second area that I just want to comment on is this reality of farm and community interdependence and the need for healthy towns and local economies. You know, it'd be rare for many farms not to also depend on off-farm employment for a farm member or family member. You know, towns provide those things. Towns provide many of the outlets that we actually need. And it's interesting, in my work over the last 2 decades, you know, in WA, a whole series of communities have kind of like done amazing things and shown the power of it. What I love about many of these, and I've only picked on a few, and there are many, many, many other examples that could be quoted, are simply examples of where people have stopped waiting for the cavalry to turn up from Perth or Canberra and realise that, you know, collectively we can make our communities better places. We can make these places where families do want to stay and kind of like contribute. And there are amazing examples of what people have actually done. You look at something just like the Darwin Field Day and its origins with kind of like a group in a service club, seeing the potential for something like that. And what has it grown into? Just one of those amazing kind of like calendar events that stands on its feet across the country. If I had to think of one town though, and it's probably the second nicest town I believe in WA after the one that you come from, I love this little town of Hyden. I love kind of like looking at its history. You know, the youngest town in WA, founded in 1922 by a group of farmers who basically pedalled out there on their bikes and started clearing and fencing the land. I find it interesting that physically ain't the most attractive kind of like of many of our towns. And yet the spirit of what I've seen go on in that town is just amazing. And the fact that not long after they settled back there in 22, they founded kind of like this local progress association, that vehicle that actually brings people together. Totally farmer driven in terms of bringing people together and their current vision statement in terms of where they're actually at. And you look at their history, and particularly in those 1960s when farming was doing pretty well. I mean, probably the best decade of the century. And yet then when that guy took that photograph and it won second prize in the New York photographic competition, and suddenly all these people started turning up to see this rock, people began to realise, hang on, here's a chance to diversify our economy. And again, it was 10 farmers who basically put in some dough to kind of like start building the infrastructure for creating what an amazing tourist destination that we actually do have. One of the biggest motel-hotel complexes anywhere in the Wheatbelt. But not just in tourism, when one looks at the way that farmers there collaborate and work together. And where kind of like farmers have come together and looked at other things. The fact that very few of them were being able to provide a job for a son or daughter back on the farm, but recognise the value in off-farm kind of like employment. And something like 22 families put in that $10,000 each to create that Hyden Business Development Company to start developing off-farm enterprises as a way of trying to diversify that economy and provide that kind of like youth employment. The way people came together recognising the importance of, you know, singles accommodation, if we want to keep young people out there, keep our footy teams and whatever strong. The importance that housing plays, not just for the elderly, but also for kind of like young singles. And the way that people out there, ordinary people like these group, came together and today have 14 kind of like youth units out there in that little town of, 400, 600 people in the district type stuff. And I love kind of like looking at communities like that, and it's just one of many that we've got. And recognising, how does all this stuff happen? It doesn't happen because someone in St George's Terrace decides it's going to happen out there. It happens because people kind of like work in community. And it seems to me when times are tough, it is one of those times that people, A, have the time, but B, it's more important then that we actually bring people together and focus on what is it we can do to build the social and the economic infrastructure. And I love just reading that kind of like story recently in the paper, again out of Hyden, that despite the fact that there are farmers out there doing it bloody tough at the present time, that whole thing about how now is also the time that we've also got to keep contributing to building that social infrastructure and that social capital kind of like within our communities. And I suppose that's the exciting bit about this power of community. Not just helping people at a personal level, but building that social capital that is just so important in terms of kind of what it is that makes these communities tick. The final thing I wanted to say is that I also believe that farmers in particular can provide an incredible leadership role in a lot of this community building. You bring, because of your work experiences, kind of like a sense of adaptation, a sense of creativity, a sense of kind of like commitment to want to make things actually happen. The other thing I think that farmers bring is a sense of humour, which I think is one of those great ingredients. And in closing, can I just share with you two little New Zealand towns who both sit on Highway 1, but both of these towns the world has passed by. These are places that you accelerate through rather than slow down and stop or spend money. Half the shops in both of these towns were closed. People came together and said, you know what, we need to diversify, we need to kind of like support our retail businesses. We recognise we've got to get people looking at how they might stop to strengthen them. The first of these towns was a place called Bulls. And I'll never forget the night when 15 people, of which over half of them were local farmers, gathered. And we talked about what is it we've got that can actually reposition this town? What's our point of difference? And obviously it was a farmer who said, you know what, it's our name, Bulls. He said, you know what, I suggest we should become a sister town to Cows in England. Or secondly, he said, we should promote ourselves as the only town in New Zealand where you get milk from bulls. He had a whole string of these kind of like silly one-liners. But what he did was act as a catalyst for another farmer and said, you know what, Bill, you're onto the right thing, mate. But you know what I suggest we become is the unforgettable town. And why don't we invite every institution in our town and every business to change their name to simply a bull name. And today there are 271 different business names and institutions. So the restaurant's full as a bull, the bank is bankable. Recently it was actually held up. Next morning the committee had a banner across the front of the bank saying robbable. And on the front page of the #1 newspaper in New Zealand. You know, here's a town that's now been written up in 4 international airline magazines. I wonder if your town has. Again, this creativity. The toilet block is called Relievable. Everyone wants to be photographed there. One church is redeemable, the other is forgivable. The town hall is kind of like sociable, all the rubbish bins are responsible. Everything in that town has become possible. And it's amazing that recently at the National Main Street Conference for Australia and New Zealand, this town took out the award as the best reinvented Main Street in Australia and New Zealand. How did it happen? A bit of humour. A couple of farmers bring in that sense of, you know what, we can actually do things and make things happen. And my final example is just up the road, a place called Tirau. And here was a woman who decided to open a wool shop. She had a very helpful farmer husband who said, listen, we can't afford to rent a property in the main street, I'll build you one. And so what did he build? He built kind of like the sheep out of corrugated iron. A few months later, the town got a mere grant of $20,000 to build a tourist centre. You can't really build a building for $20,000. But the helpful husband farmer had a few other mates. He said, you know what, the sheep needs a sheepdog. And so they decided to build a tourist and the toilet block kind of like next door. And so you've now got this in the main street. The church next door is called the Church of the Good Shepherd, and they've kind of like decided to kind of like get involved, as has now 171 local businesses have adopted this whole new art form called corrugated art. And it's become an amazing outdoor gallery as you drive through the town, seeing these amazing things. You know, today, they used to have 12 years ago a competition to see which businesses closed the quickest on a Saturday. I drove through this town a few weeks ago on a Sunday and there were 42 businesses opened on a Sunday. They've attracted in 5 new cafes, 2 new restaurants, a boutique brewery, 4 new antique shops. It's interesting to just see. And where did it come from? Just again, that group of farmers deciding to use a bit of that creativity, a bit of good old farmer humour, and boy, things can happen. In closing though, can I say that we do live in a country and a society where the sense of community is definitely on decline. I tend to equate it a bit like to an Aussie Rules football game where 30,000 people who need the exercise turn up to watch 36 players who don't. And it seems to me that many of our towns still are being run that way. We need to start re-engaging people. And we simply do live, as I said, in a society where disengagement, rather engagement, is the order of the day. You know, as a nation now, we have people actually over for dinner, and we're talking about friends, half as often as we did 10 years ago. We're likely to be on our kids' parents and citizens group at the local school half as often as we were 5 years ago. Simply, we are not connecting, particularly at the organisational and even at the personal interaction level. And it just seems to me that we've got to rebirth this thing, the importance of community, the importance of social capital. To me, social capital is much more important than human capital, physical capital and financial capital. It's what actually makes a difference both socially and economically. And I suppose we've just got to see the power of community and what it can do. And so in closing, there are so many starting points where you can basically see things. We've still got this infrastructure. One of them is this interesting thing called the men's shed movement, whereas Rotary clubs and Lions clubs are on rapid member decline. This is now the fastest growing movement, social movement in the country. We've now got over 140,000 men caught up in that. Again, they provide wonderful opportunities for kind of like starting to do things. So in closing, can we take our lesson from a few sheep? And secondly, I love to just share the words of Bill Mollison, who founded the permaculture, who said, "I can't save the world on my own, it'll take at least 3 of us." And it seems to me we need each other. We certainly need at community level to be holding hands with each other, and it needs to be a message that we need to be promoting out there in terms of tough times. It's even more important that we start holding hands with each other effectively at that community level. Thanks very much.